Here are my body language tips for teachers. Number 1 is be open. So if you stand like this in your classroom, leaning back, your arms crossed, students are going to feel like you're not that friendly and you're not that interested in what they have to say. Instead, stand with an open posture. So your arms are open, you're kind of standing up tall, you're looking at them, and you are ready to hear what they have to say. The second thing is eye contact. So I was teaching a presentation in public speaking class, and I was teaching my students about how to make eye contact with their audience. And one brave student put up their hand and actually said, "Jackie, you actually never look at the front left part of the classroom." And I said, "Oh no, really?" And it was true. I actually would scan the class. I'd kind of look here and here and here, but I would actually never look at the front left people. So those people were very lonely, and actually students wouldn't often sit there because they kind of felt like I ignored them. So after that, I was very conscious of like where I was looking, and I would kind of try to scan the entire class within 30 seconds. If it's a smaller class, even shorter amount of time, like every 10 seconds or 15 seconds, something like that. But make sure you have no dead spots or there's just places that you don't look. Make sure you're looking at all the students in your class, no matter where they're sitting. The third thing is to smile and look friendly and look approachable. Be especially cautious with kind of your resting face. So this is the face you're making when you're not talking, when students are just kind of doing an activity. If you look like kind of grumpy or a little bit like angry, students will kind of just think like, oh, this is not a great class for me, or this teacher is not actually that friendly or interested in me. So just make sure you kind of look friendly and look approachable and you have a little bit of a smile on your face. The next thing is to pay attention to what you're doing with your hands. So when I'm talking, I'll often cross my hands, but when I want students to answer, I'll use my hands and I'll say, okay, I'll say like, how was your weekend? And then I'll put my hands out like this, and that just invites students to give me an answer. The next thing you can do is to nod your head. So when students are talking to you, if you nod your head, it just shows that you're interested and curious about what they have to say. And the final tip for teachers for body language is to be confident. So if you kind of just stand with your shoulders slumped and your arms crossed and looking down, you look not confident at all. Instead, stand up straight and tall, put your shoulders back, your hands kind of open, your head is up. Look confident, and you'll instill confidence in your class, in your students, that you know what you're doing, you're a real teacher, and you're able just to go in and manage that class. So those are all my tips for body language for teachers. Here are some tips for giving instructions for an ESL or EFL classroom. The first tip is to use simple graded language. By graded language, I mean it's simpler in terms of vocabulary or grammar, and also that you're speaking more slowly than you normally would. Of course, how you grade this language really depends on the level of students. So kind of like people who are almost fluent, advanced level, they could probably handle just instructions, just kind of how you would normally give instructions to someone, maybe your friend or family member. However, for beginners, simple is best. After all, the challenge should be English. It shouldn't be in understanding the instructions of an activity or game that you're doing in class. So think very simple, give a demonstration, pictures, all of those things. The second tip for giving instructions is to not forget about ICQs. ICQs are instruction checking questions. So I do this with every level. After I give some instructions about how to do something, I ask some very simple questions. For example, how many people are in your group? 3. What do you need? I need my book and a pen. What page number? Page 13. Which exercise? A, B, or C? B. So I just want everybody to be on the same page. So I ask some very simple questions. Even if it seems obvious, it's still worth it because there's usually at least 1 or 2 people who maybe haven't understood what you've said. And this is just kind of a way to catch those people. And hopefully everyone will be on the same page and doing exactly what you would like them to be doing in your class. The third tip is to give a demonstration. So when I've been in Korean classes or just other language classes, if a teacher is giving me instructions in a language that's not my own, chances are that I didn't really understand all of it. But if you give a demonstration plus telling students how to do something, this is a way for kind of the visual learners and just even everybody in the class to kind of see exactly what you mean. It's hard to get it wrong if the teacher does exactly what they expect students to be doing afterwards. The fourth tip is to teach classroom language. You could teach things that are relevant to giving instructions. For example, open your book, pick up your pen, put down your pen, we're on page 17, that kind of thing. The fifth tip about giving instructions is to circulate around the classroom. So after you give your instructions, you do your demo for an activity, don't just sit down at your desk in front of the classroom and hope the students are getting it right. Instead, circulate around the class, kind of eavesdrop, see what students are doing, take a quick peek at their workbook, whatever students are working on, always be circulating and kind of just helping the students that may not have understood exactly what you wanted them to do. All right, so those are my tips for giving instructions in an ESL or EFL classroom. Here are my top 7 classroom management tips for very young learners. My first tip is to use routines. So I think almost everybody, when they enter into a classroom, they like a mix of like kind of routines, the familiar, the old, with a little bit of new things mixed in. But however, I think for very young learners, they especially like routines. If it's a little bit chaotic, the student's behavior is going to be chaotic. They won't really know where to sit, what to do, what they should be doing. They won't understand, should I be talking? Should I not be talking? Using routines can kind of alleviate this. So I like to have routines for everything. So how we, like, for example, even pack up at the end of the day, how we line up, how we ask to go to the bathroom, how we begin class, how we sit in a circle, how we share things with the class, etc. So use lots of routines in your classroom. The second tip for very young learners is to teach them how to do things. So my very first year in Korea, I worked at a Korean kindergarten, a Hagwon, and I had these like very young students. They were like 3 or 4 years old. And I don't know what I was exactly thinking, but I somehow thought, oh, they know how to hold a pencil. They like know how to ask to go to the bathroom. They actually knew nothing. They literally knew nothing. So they didn't know how to hold a pencil. They didn't know like even basic, the simplest English, of course, because they're just little kids. So when you're teaching very young learners, just remember you're starting at ground zero. So if you say pick up your pencil, students may not actually know how to hold a pencil. So you may have to like teach them these things, and they may not know, you see a kid looking quite anxious, quite worried. They don't know how to say bathroom in English, something like that. So kind of just teach students things that can help them kind of function effectively in a classroom. You may be one of their very first teachers, and it may actually just be your job and your responsibility to do this. So kind of going along with that is the next tip: teach classroom vocabulary first. So if you're trying to say open your book to page 17 and students don't know book, open, page 17, it can kind of be a real struggle for everyone to literally be on the same page. Or like pick up your pencil, stand up, sit down, can I go to the bathroom? All of those things. So I like to spend at least a couple classes teaching classroom vocabulary just so the rest of the course will go that much more smoothly. All right, the next tip for teaching very young learners, and this is a tip especially for those, say, teaching in like Korea or Japan, teaching at like Korean kindergartens or Japanese kindergartens or wherever you are in the world, if you're teaching students in a language that you don't share and maybe you don't speak their language, my tip is to not rely on others for everything. So it can be tempting to kind of rely on a co-teacher or the admin at the school to translate for you, to handle all your discipline issues. However, that's not actually going to work out that well long term because students won't really respect you. So just think, I have to rely on my own teaching skills to manage this classroom. And so kind of whatever you need to do in terms of like routines and teaching classroom vocab and just kind of making it work. So don't rely on someone else who shares that language with the students to always do all the things for you. They're going to get annoyed at you. They're going to be like frustrated. They're going to feel like, why are you asking me to do all these things for you? So just try to do what you can to do it yourself. It's going to make your classroom run that much more smoothly, and that people at the school are not going to get annoyed at you. So the fifth tip I have is that seating arrangements are often quite important. So kind of just think carefully about your space and how many students you have. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that there's often students who are kind of like loud and love talking, and then there's a few quiet students. So think about separating the very loud students who love talking. I kind of have a one-strike policy for this. Students, I let them sit wherever they want at the beginning of class. For the first class, and the second they prove to me that they cannot handle sitting with their BFF, it's finished. And then I will move them to another spot. And I often find that putting kind of the loudest, kind of the one that's misbehaving the most, right directly in front of me is often the best case. So I can literally stand beside them for much of the class. Even while I'm lecturing, I'll sometimes put my hand on their desk, and I'm just always right there to kind of prevent any problems or issues. So think about your seating arrangements carefully. All right, the next tip for teaching very young learners is to use a variety of activities. So young learners, they like using routines and like kind of the familiar, and they know what to expect, but then also using a variety of games and activities can kind of just create some interest and kind of make English class or whatever class you're teaching a little bit more exciting, because students will have something to look forward to in your class, and they don't quite know what it is, but they know there's usually something fun to do in that class at the end. All right, the next tip I have for very young learners is to have some early finisher tasks. There's always those 1 or 2 students who finish everything in about like a 1/10 of the time that you've allotted, and good for them. They're like kind of the, smart kids who can like figure out things, or they figured out a system, or they like know how to do things quickly. I was one of those students too. I like doing things at the maximum speed possible generally. But I like to have some early finisher tasks and kind of some routines on how to handle that. Because if students finish things in 1 minute and the rest of the students take 10 minutes, what are they doing for those other 9 minutes? So usually if you don't have anything going on, it's disrupting the other students. So I love to have some tasks, some coloring, some little simple worksheets, that kind of thing to manage that. All right, so those are my tips for teaching very young learners related to classroom management. Here's how to deal with difficult students in an ESL or EFL classroom. The first idea I have is just to talk to the student. So you can either do this kind of just maybe after class, or just kind of take them outside of class for a minute and just say, what's going on? How come you're not listening? Or you seem really unhappy in my class. What's up? And if you teach ESL, it depends on the level of the students. Maybe they can answer you and understand that. Maybe they can't. If they can't, then you can kind of just enlist some help, maybe some admin person or a co-teacher, something like that. But just have a little chat with a student. And I often start it off with kind of you seem unhappy in my class. What's wrong? Or what can I do to make it better? And students will often just think, oh, she actually cares and she understands, she wants to know what's happening. And after that, I find that students often are not such a problem once you have that kind of friendly, nice conversation with them. The second thing you can do is to give problem students some extra tasks. So I don't mean in a burdensome way, but if someone has to hand out worksheets, hand back worksheets, do attendance, clean the whiteboard off, I would often give those tasks to the problem students so they can kind of feel useful and can kind of just have something else to focus on besides their bad behavior in your class. The third thing is to really consider whether you have boring lessons. I mean, some students are going to misbehave no matter what kind of lesson you have, but if you have a lot of students misbehaving, it might be because your lessons are kind of boring and not that relevant to the needs or the interests of the students in your class. So really examine that and answer that question honestly. Are my lessons boring? The fourth thing you can do to deal with difficult students is to enlist some help. So if you're really, really struggling and you've kind of tried all the other strategies that I'll mention in this video, but it's not really working and some student just keeps misbehaving and misbehaving, you can enlist some help. Maybe ask a co-teacher or the principal at your school just to kind of find out what's going on with the students. And just one thing to keep in mind is that it often has nothing to do with you. Maybe if you have a teenager and their parents are getting divorced, or they just broke up with their girlfriend, or they're being bullied at their other school, something like that, and they're misbehaving in your class, that really has nothing to do with you. So it can be helpful to kind of have some background knowledge or information about what's happening with that student, just to have some empathy or some patience or just a little bit of extra love for that student who might really be struggling. The next tip is to think about seating location. So If you have one student who's misbehaving in your class, I often will just put them right in front of me in the front row, and I will make them sit there the entire class, the entire semester. Students don't really love it, but I find that it kind of turns the problem person into often quite a good student, and I'll call on them, I'll ask them for help handing out papers and that kind of thing. So that's just a nice kind of like low confrontational way to deal with a very difficult student. If you have lots of students who are creating problems, I would make a seating chart in that class. So kind of just mix it up. If you have, say, 4 problem students, put one left, right, and just kind of separate them, and there will be less problems in your class. The next tip for dealing with difficult students is just to move on. So, I mean, it's not always helpful to pick a battle about every single thing. So if a student is misbehaving, you can ignore some things and just kind of move on and not worry about it too much. I would only really pay attention to the big problems. For example, talking over another student, hitting, fighting, just really bad things, kind of the more moderately bad things or small bad things. If there's a lot going on in the class, just ignore those things and instead focus on the positive things that other students are doing, and focus on that instead of with that difficult student. The next thing you can do is literally stand next to the difficult student. If they're misbehaving, standing next to that student and I always put my hand, not on them, I don't like to touch my students, but I like to put my hand kind of on their desk or just kind of on their paper. And I just kind of stand there and while everyone's doing some quiet work. If you're standing next to that student, I guarantee that they are going to be doing the work as well. And if you see them kind of start to misbehave or something happening, just go stand next to them, and that can often prevent a lot of problems. The next thing you can do is to call on that student who's causing a problem. So if students are doing some kind of pair or group work and then you're kind of just rounding off the activity and you want to elicit some answers, choose the problem students in your class. That will help them focus, they'll pay attention, and hopefully they will give kind of a good answer and you can give them some praise and encouragement, and they can kind of get some feedback about something positive that they're doing in your class instead of something negative. The next thing is to have low expectations. So, I mean, you're in an ESL class, maybe in another country, maybe you only see the students once a week or once every 2 weeks, maybe you have 40 students in your class, whatever the case might be. Expecting miracles in terms of everyone behaving perfectly and listening to you, it might be a bit of a stretch. If students don't really know you and don't see you that much, they don't really have a lot of respect for you. And that's okay, it's no problem. You can still teach students effectively, but you're not their homeroom teacher and they don't have this love for you. They don't necessarily have this respect. So just kind of lower your expectations and just chill out a little bit. And that leads me to the final thing, which I briefly mentioned before. Don't take things personally. Students have a lot going on. Their misbehavior may not have anything to do with you. So just don't worry about it. Let it slide off your back. Don't let it affect you or get you down. Just go into class, the next class, with a smile on your face, and just try to have a fresh start for everyone. And just because someone misbehaved in a previous class doesn't mean that they're going to misbehave in the next class. So a fresh start, and don't think too deeply about it. Don't worry too much about it. Just let it go. Here are my tips for teaching mixed level ESL or EFL classes. The first tip is to focus on the middle. If you have a class with a huge range of levels, it can be hard to cater to the very, very weakest student and then also the very, very best student. It's just not that practical. So I would focus on maybe the middle, say 80% of people, and there's always going to be a few students in almost every class who would struggle no matter what you do. And there's maybe always a few students who've studied in Canada or went to high school in the US or something. So obviously an ESL class is not going to challenge them, and that's kind of okay. I just mostly kind of accept it as it is what it is, and I have a mixed level class, and that's just how it's going to be, and I try not to worry about it too much. Instead, I just kind of focus on the middle 80% generally. The second way to handle a mixed level class is to use lots of pair and group work. So I would do this in almost every class, but this is especially important in mixed level classes. Because if you're just standing there lecturing to people, it's not really student centered. And also it's like probably the weaker students won't understand you, the higher level students will be super bored. But if you put students into pairs or in group work, they can kind of just get an opportunity to use whatever language at whatever level they're at, instead of just the teacher imposing their level on the class. Another tip for mixed level classes is if you give grades, like I did when I was teaching in a Korean university. Only do one test. It can be tempting to kind of do a lower level test and then a higher level test. However, it's really not fair if you're grading everyone according to kind of the same criteria, because the higher level students will be annoyed that they have to do a harder test, they have to study more, maybe they'll get a C, when in reality they could have not even studied and probably got an A+ on that lower level test. So only give one test. And don't worry too much about that. I think it's actually better in the end. And if students, for example, if they do student surveys or teacher surveys, the students are going to hate it if you give two tests. And some of the better students in the class get lower grades just because their test was harder. So avoid this at all costs. It's always a mistake. The next tip for teaching multi-level classes is to have learning stations. So this is when you set up little activities or little worksheets, little projects the students can do. They move around the classroom kind of at their own pace and choosing what they want to work on. So have some kind of easier ones, some medium ones, and some more difficult ones. And students can kind of choose what they want to work on. And maybe a very low level student, even doing the easiest activity, it might take them 30 minutes. Where some of the higher level students, maybe they can move around the class and do 4 or 5 activities in that same amount of time. So this is a nice way to kind of like target and cater to all the levels in your class. The next tip for teaching multi-level classes is to offer some free practice opportunities. So this will really challenge your higher level students to use whatever language they are capable of. So I always like to do kind of some teaching of a grammar or vocabulary concept, then I do some controlled practice, like maybe in the textbook you might find, and then freer practice. So this is where students are allowed to use any language that they want. The lower level students will probably only use the language that you taught them, where the higher level students will use a whole bunch of kind of different, interesting language, and that is just an opportunity for them to kind of show off what they know. The next tip for teaching multi-level classes is to give personalized feedback. So students often expect the native English teacher to give feedback, and that's okay. That's a great expectation for them to have. If I'm teaching a class that's all the same level, it's actually really easy to give feedback to the entire class. But mixed level classes, it's a little bit trickier because what you're saying to the lower level students is often very different than what you're saying to the higher level students. So I really like to target it to the students in particular if I can. So when they're doing an activity, you can kind of walk around, eavesdrop, see what students are doing, and kind of just give some quick little snippets of feedback to the different levels of students in your class. The final tip for teaching mixed level classes is to do a bunch of activities, kind of like surveys and little small talk mingle activities. So students can have an opportunity to talk to a bunch of different people in the class. You don't want like one of the really good students to be stuck with the lowest level student in the class, nor do you want that lower level student to have to talk to one of the higher level students in the class all the time because they won't understand what's happening. Instead, if you do a survey activity, you'll have a bunch of different people talking to each other all the time, and students can get an opportunity to maybe speak a bit simpler for the lower level student. They can challenge themselves with a higher level student, and they can also have some conversations with people at the same level. One of my favorite tips for ESL or EFL teachers is to mix groups up. So maybe you've noticed in your class, so students tend to sit with the same 1 or 2 people every single class. They are usually friends, so it's fine if they sit with them once in a while, but then sometimes I like to make random groups. The reason I do this is because it gets boring talking to the same old person each day, even if it is your friend. And I always kind of have some empathy for the person that's stuck with the worst person in the class who can barely speak English, because that person who's with them every single class isn't really improving their English ability. And conversely, what happens with the best student in the class, and they are always stuck with the same person, and that one person maybe feels like, oh, everyone is so good at English and not me. It doesn't really get the actual like real experience of just speaking English with someone at their level. So mix groups up. I choose random numbers. So I'll say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The number 1s can go together, number 2s can go together, that kind of thing. Here are my top 10 ESL classroom management tips for handling an out-of-control classroom. Number 1, remember that you are not the student's friend. You are their teacher. Sure, you can have a friendly relationship with your students, but above all else, you are their teacher. So you need to enforce discipline if that is required. You need to actually teach them something. You need to plan lessons, do all of those things. And the second tip for classroom management is to set clear expectations. So if you don't want students using cell phones in your class, tell students this. If you don't want them eating a bunch of snacks at all class, tell them this at the beginning of the course. So set your expectations and then follow through with them. That leads me to the third tip, follow through. Never say something that you don't mean. So if you promise students a pizza party, if they do something amazing, follow through with the pizza party. If you tell students, if you use your phone in class, I'm going to take it away for the rest of the class, and then you see someone using their phone, follow through with that and take away that phone for the rest of the class. Number 4 is to elicit support with the most difficult students. So that could be a co-teacher, it could be parents, it could be the administration of your school. If you have a particularly difficult student that you're struggling to manage or handle, elicit support and get the support that you need to manage that situation. The 5th tip for an out-of-control class is to scold privately. So no one likes to be scolded in front of all their peers or all their friends. So if you have to do it, I recommend talking to the student after class or just even take them out of class for 20 seconds or 30 seconds and just talk to them outside of class and find out what's going on, what you expect from them. So you can tell them the expectations that you have for further classes. The 6th tip for an out-of-control classroom is if there is a particularly bad student in your class, ask them what's up. Chances are it's not really related to you, but maybe their parents are getting divorced, maybe they just lost their job, maybe they're getting divorced, maybe they're very hungry and sleepy, just whatever it is. So ask students what's going on and what can I do to make this class better for you. Students will often give you some illuminating answers, and just by even asking that question, they'll also know that you care. The 7th tip for managing an out-of-control ESL class is to not take things personally. So this is related to the previous tip. There's a lot of things going on in students' lives, and oftentimes it will have nothing to do with you. So if you have a particularly bad class, don't worry about it. Just let it go. Everything will pass at a certain point in time. That class will be done, you'll get new students, and you can start over. The 8th tip is to have a seating plan. So if you let students sit wherever they want, it can often not get you the results you want or need in terms of participation and people listening to you and that kind of thing. So if you have a problematic class, I recommend using a seating chart, especially if you teach kids or teenagers. If you put a boy with a girl, that's often a surefire way to guarantee students will be listening to you more and chatting with their friends less. The 9th tip is to focus on positive reinforcement. So if you are struggling with an out-of-control class, find even the smallest examples of good things. For example, Minkyu, you did such a good job finishing that exercise. Or thank you for participating. Thank you for cleaning up that trash that you saw on the floor. Whatever it is, praise students, and hopefully you are praising students more than you're scolding students. And the final and most important tip for dealing with an out-of-control class is to always keep your cool. Never show students that you're angry. Never yell, never raise your voice. If necessary, I will sometimes turn my body to the board and I'll be writing something on the board and I'll just be like, and I'll say to myself, this is really difficult, but you're gonna get through this. Or if I feel myself losing my cool, I'll just say to my students, do this exercise, whatever, page 7, exercise number 1, and then I'll just go outside the class for a minute and I'll just take a few deep breaths, I'll just collect myself, and then I'll come back in and continue with the class. So if you feel yourself getting angry, just remove yourself from that situation. Don't go too far away. Just stay outside your classroom door. And also, if your classroom door locks and it's particularly troublesome, I probably wouldn't leave the class. I'd probably just turn my body away from the board. But yeah, don't ever yell or show your anger in front of the students. That's not going to get you the results that you want. So please be sure to check out my book, Teaching ESL for Dummies. I'll put the link right up there, and please hit like, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Bye, everybody.